We're on Lake Texoma this evening. We are getting ready to do our juvenile striped bass seining sampling. This is something that we do annually to track striped bass recruitment at Lake Texoma. It's very important that we keep track of how well fish have spawned, how well their reproduction was each year, so we'll know kind of what the future holds for the fishery. So this is the early detection that we have for getting that information. The fish would have spawned a couple of months ago, and so this is our first look at what this year's cohort or this year's age class is going to look like for striped bass on Texoma. So tonight we're in the upper portion of Lake Texoma on the Red River Arm. We have a number of sites that we sample each evening. We start in the upper end of the lake because that's where these small fish are located. They would have migrated down or floated downstream as eggs, fertilized eggs, and then hatched in the upper part of the lake. And so what we will do is select these areas, these beach areas. These fish will move in the evening, and that's how we can collect them with this seining technique.
They are in their native range. They're from the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, and they are an anadromous fish. That means they live their life in coastal and estuarine waters. They go long distances up fresh water to spawn. They need to be able to release the eggs, have them fertilized, and then drift back to the nursery habitat for several days before they hatch. So there's really specific spawning requirements that a striper needs to have in order to reproduce naturally. Despite being stocked in hundreds of impoundments across the United States, there's only been a handful of lakes where natural reproduction has been documented. Two of those lakes are in Oklahoma, being Lake Texoma right here and Lake Keystone. And both of these lakes have long free-flowing river systems that enable these fish to go up the rivers at the right time of year to be able to spawn.
These stripers are going to be anywhere from 2 to 2.5 months old at this time. We're looking at fish that are anywhere from 2.5, 3.5 inches long.
Striped bass generally spawn here on Lake Texoma in the month of April and the first half of May. We figure about a 45-day window. And when the calendar's right, when the water temperature's right, and when we get some precipitation that results in water flowing down the rivers and a peak in the hydrographs, these fish will work themselves upriver anywhere from 30 to almost 90 miles upriver on the Washita and the Red River, and will spawn in those locations. Over the next few days after that, the semi-buoyant egg needs to be transported in water current back towards the lake, where it'll hatch, and then eventually, you know, as it grows throughout the first weeks and months of its life, will work its way throughout the reservoir.
We'll always start 30 minutes after sunset, and that reduces the amount of variability that we see in our seine hauls, but also these fish just aren't up in this shallow hot water on these, you know, sandy beaches like this during the middle of the day. So at night when the water cools off, there's less predators in the area, these fish will move into shallow water, and it allows us to use a seine to collect them. Rachel, just stretch it, David, and keep it low. Keep it low, low, low. Just drag it across. There you go. There you go. You got some fish in there. All right, nice and slow. Keep going. Okay. You look at the fish from the side, you don't really see it, but how we identify the striped bass, if you look along the top of it, it has these vertical bars, kind of looks like tiger striping. They call those par marks, and that's one of the characteristics that we use to identify the striped bass versus the native white bass that we also have in Texoma. Here's an example of a white bass, and if you rotate that fish, you won't really see those par marks, those vertical bars. But at this stage, these two cousins are pretty similar in size and shape and color, so that's one of the characteristics that we look for.
We're seeing a variation in sizes. Here's a pretty good sized striped bass for this time of year, all the way down to here's one that's considerably smaller. Two things could happen. One, since we have a fairly lengthy spawning period, one could just be older than the other, several weeks, maybe a month older than the other. Also, we start seeing differences in diet selection. The smaller size stripers are generally eating zooplankton and insects, whereas the larger ones that will continue to outgrow the smaller members of the same cohort have learned to capture and select other fish. They've turned to piscivory. They're eating a lot of silver sides and young of the year shad, so a much more advantageous diet that they're consuming, which is giving them accelerated growth. So these are all small young of year stripers that were collected in our first seine haul. It looks really optimistic at this point, and illustrates that not only did the stripers get off a successful spawn, but looks like we've got a great year class that our anglers are going to enjoy in the years to come.
So while we're doing this, we're just trying to keep this seine moving as fast as possible, but keeping it low right down on the bottom so the fish can't escape underneath the seine. Pull that bottom part, Rachel, grab the bottom, pull it up, there you go. All right, everybody's in.
Here's another large white bass right here. So we've got a mixture of some young predators like the stripers and white bass. We've got different shad species. Here's a juvenile silver side. It's an important food item for these young stripers and age 1 stripers that are out there.
Right now what we're doing is we're sorting out the 2 maronid species, which are the temperate bass. That includes the white bass and the striped bass. We're separating those out, identifying those fish and separating them into 2 different buckets. After we've completed that task, then we'll go back and count how many of each species were collected at this spot. So this left-hand bucket is our striped bass, juvenile striped bass, and good numbers there. The bucket on the right are the white bass. Obviously from these numbers you can see that there were a lot more striped bass spawn this year, at least at this site where we've sampled, but the spawn was obviously really good for striped bass because those numbers are really strong.
So what we're doing here is we're keeping a subsample of these striped bass. We're able to take a small bone out of the head of these fish called an otolith, and we can prepare them in such a way that we can count daily rings. From this we're able to tell what day they were spawned on, and we're able to match that up with, hopefully be able to match that up with the hydrograph or what was going on in the river at that point, and to see if they spawned early in the season or later in the season, or what kind of flow that was beneficial to them.
So one of the unique things about Lake Texoma is the natural reproduction of the striped bass. Most North American reservoirs with striped bass have to stock those populations. Lake Texoma is one of very few lakes that actually have naturally reproducing fish. The interesting thing on Texoma is we have two river systems that allow for that reproduction, the Ouachita River and the Red River. Now we're on the Red River tonight doing our sampling, but in the past research has shown that these fish will swim anywhere from 45 to 80 miles upriver, up the Red, because it's unimpounded. They have the ability to swim and migrate long distances up into the Red. They lay their eggs. The males and females will congregate. The eggs are fertilized in rapid flowing water. They're fertilized there, and those semi-buoyant eggs are transported back down into Lake Texoma. If there wasn't enough flow, those eggs would eventually settle to the bottom, and those fertilized eggs would suffocate and would never actually hatch. So we need the springtime flows to transport those eggs downriver all the way back to right at the mouth of the river where it meets the lake, and that's where those fish will hatch, and that's where those juveniles will have the opportunities to forage and begin their early portions of their life.
Different species of fish have different reproductive strategies. The striped bass swims upriver, will release a massive amount of eggs, but there's zero parental care. It's just left up to the river currents to take the egg to the favorable nursery habitat. Other species of fish, like a threadfin shad, will put their adhesive egg on rocks or vegetation or on docks, and a little bit different. They put their egg in a place, and it's not as vulnerable as eggs flowing down the river. But then there's other species of fish like crappie or bass, bluegill, that'll actually make a nest, and they will sit there and guard those eggs and even the small fry until they're less vulnerable to predation. So they put a lot more parental care into their egg investment. But again, the striped bass, they release their egg in the current, and just a massive amounts of them, knowing that a fair amount of them will make it back to the nursery habitat that is needed. So these are all striped bass, the same year class. Obviously, a lot different in size. Got this giant right here, all the way down to intermediate sized and a small one. Likely these were maybe spawned at the beginning of the season, perhaps spawned at the end of the season. And this one, just by body size and large mouth, he's going to be able to consume a fish diet a lot easier than what a small one like this will, that'll probably be limited to zooplankton and insects most of its first year of life. Lake Texoma is arguably one of the state's most economically and recreationally important fisheries. So with striped bass being king on Lake Texoma. So this is one thing that we can do to ensure we have a good idea of what's going on with the striped bass population, get an early look at what this year class is going to be like for the future, enables us to have some good talking points with people of what to expect in the years to come, as well as just a general management of our fisheries, as we're not going to be able to effectively sample these with gill nets for a couple of years.
You know, this isn't the striped bass that our anglers are looking for, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle. It lets us know how strong a given year class of fish are, how good the spawn was that year, and we can track these changes in the numbers of these fish that we collect during this type of sampling. So during drought years, we see fewer of these, but also during good flow years, high water springs, we see a lot of these fish. And what that does, it allows us to communicate with our constituents, let them know what the future looks like. This is a fish that will be in our recreational fishery year and a half, 2 years from now. And so we can educate our anglers about what's coming on in the future years and kind of give them ideas about the trends that we see in the fishery and predict what the fishing success might be in coming years.